Well, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I see lots of familiar faces, and looking forward to sharing with you what we've been learning and working on in terms of how we support U.S. education. And what I'm hoping is that it might offer you just some new ways of thinking about how you embrace healthcare workers and think about their training journey. We're in the midst of learning, and so what I'm sharing with you is kind of an update on what we're learning. And I hope to glean some of your thoughts and questions to add to our learning so that we can continue learning about education across the foundation. And so, as Oren introduced, I'm Jamie Hord. I've been here at the foundation for about 10 years. I've had a number of roles. Currently, I'm a deputy director in the Office of the President, and I had the pleasure of helping lead an effort this past year that really looked at our work in a new way. Traditionally, our work is in strategies that are kind of grown up and designed to solve a specific problem within education. So we had our K-12, our post-secondary, even more recently, early learning. And each of those kind of stuck to their knitting. And we weren't making much of a sweater in terms of putting arms and parts of the sweater together. So the effort last year was to look at the continuum of education and think about what's the student's experience from preschool, which is the P in P16, and 16, sort of that going into that post-secondary education. And again, I'm not going to get overly detailed because I'm hoping it's just illustrative and has you maybe think in a new way, because it helped us to think in a new way. Because when we looked across that student experience, it had us looking at equity in a different way, and it helped us think about the connections in our work in a different way. And so that's just some of what I hope to evoke for you. Let's see. Oh, and we also found that one of the best ways to learn about this information and to think about this information was to interact with it. So fair warning, there will be interaction. So let's start now. So raise your hand if you spent all of your education experience in the US, P to 16. Raise your hand, raise your hand. Okay. Raise your hand if it was some of your experience. Okay. Excellent. So everybody's had an educational journey. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is what we uncovered about the U.S. We had 4 objectives. We were looking to connect our strategies. This wasn't a new strategy. This was a mindset, a way to think about how a student moves across that, and really hold in our minds 2 things. We were really good about thinking about the system, and we needed to add to that mindset the student's experience. So when you're talking about intermediaries that give training to teachers, that gets you pretty far removed from the actual student. And we wanted to get that back into our mindset, not because that might change where we interact, but although I'll show you some places where it did, but so that we'd keep that at the front and center. And hold both of those pieces in our minds. We also needed a framework so that we could think about an analytical framework. And for the first time, I know it sounds silly, but are they students or are they kids? Are they faculty or are they teachers? And I say that because it's jargon, but that gets down to sometimes the data that we're collecting and trying to understand. And how do we work across and have that analytical framework inside? And it had the additional benefit of helping us think about how do we show up more cohesively in a state? Because when you show up in a state, they've got them from preschool to post-secondary. So we kind of needed to figure out how to knit it together. So this is an end product. It's a dynamic framework. You can kind of go in and click at it. If you're here at the foundation, we'll make sure you have the links to it because you can go in and explore this. But what we curated for ourselves were 37 momentum points at which we thought, based on the data, there was enough students and enough of an effect size that these things really mattered in their education. And we organized them into 4 areas. And today, rather than having to be really detailed and knowing what each one of these is, what I think you might take away from this are the 4 areas. What are some of the reoccurring issues, things that plague students throughout the process? What are some of the social and emotional skills and factors that really predict success? This was an interesting one to bring on because we didn't have a ton of data, but there was that hunch factor of we think this is making, it's promising, and it is showing up more and more. And I wouldn't be surprised if this has value and meaning as you think about healthcare systems and training healthcare workers. Academic benchmarks are what's the content that they need to learn, and what does the early content tell you about potential success of getting to the end. And then the enabling environments. No surprise here, our K-12 post-secondary and our Washington States all think that digital tools matter, because at this foundation, that's a tool we know how to use. So it helped us, so you see those, each of the gray bars is a factor. You see where our strategies are starting to press down on those factors or get engaged in those factors. What's interesting is we don't release this publicly because it would create a big expectation that we work in all of these areas. But it was important for us to understand that things like student mobility matter. I grew up, my family moved every year and a half to 2 years. And I had situations where I'd walk into the elementary school and they'd say, okay, next year you'll learn long division. And then I'd move and they'd say, oh, you should have learned long division. So to this day, I can't do long division. So student mobility matters. That's my experience. So these are things that, again, just to keep us in the mindset, but again, not because it's what we do, but because it matters. And we might think about over time, are other partners better placed to do this? Are they doing something about it? So it was really an important, this is sort of more the theory of change rather than the red, where our strategies are, might be our theory of action, places where we're kind of getting involved. Okay, we're gonna make it real. So in your workbook, pages 6 to 9 have the factors. I want you to take a moment and make some marks for yourself of your education experience and things that had an impact on you. I'm going to ask you in a moment, after you've had some reflection, to share with someone at your table. So fair warning. So take a moment, get out your pen, make some notations. So I'd like you to turn to your neighbor, and you're going to share with your neighbor some of the relevant factors for you. And I'm going to give you enough time to switch and have each person talk for a couple minutes. You don't have to tell your life story. But I'm really just priming you to think about, to start to generate, what do you think some of the factors might be for healthcare workers in each of these categories? Some of the reoccurring issues, some of the emotional and social factors, some of the training things that are really incredibly important to get early, and the enabling environment. So that's the generative part of the discussion. But take a couple minutes and share what was relevant in your experience first. So turn to your partner, and I'll give you a few minutes. So did anybody, in your generating ideas, kind of think about what of these factors might be relevant or what additional factors might be relevant to healthcare workers? Anything come up for folks? We have a mic for people, so raise your hand. You were just talking.
Hello. I thought high expectations resonated with me personally as when I was a student, but I think also to the extent healthcare workers feel connected with their community and that they're valued and that their services are important. I think that's an important motivating factor.
Yeah, we also see that in the social emotional factors, the sense of belonging. We have schools as early as middle school starting to say, you belong in college, and really setting the tone for that sense of belonging and that this is where you deserve to be. Other factors that resonated and that translated?
One of the things we talked about both for our own upbringing and then also transferable to healthcare workers was the role of both gender, religion, and culture as being huge influences here, as well as certainly with healthcare workers, and how that may or may not fit within this framework, or it's an additional component upon it.
Excellent. Some additional context that you might want to put into the framework. That's great. Things this has had, maybe other things this generated for you that you didn't see in our framework, but it makes you think about what's relevant in your work. Yes. She's coming.
We didn't get to the part of how it impacts health workers, but we talked a bit about how rote memorization-based education impacts critical thinking, and I would see that as a big thing with health workers. If they grew up in an environment where thinking about what you don't know and just focusing on what you do know impacts how you problem solve at the facility level, and how you absorb training and sort of follow it rote rather than thinking through how to apply it to different scenarios.
Interesting. That's a really, I'm still trying to picture how you grapple with that. That's a really great insight. One more insight or question or thought this provoked for you? Yes.
So one thing which we discussed was, which again we are not very sure where does it fit in with respect to the health workers, that how overwhelmed they are, because whatever interventions we want to have in the field with the beneficiaries, we go to the same health worker, whether it is vaccination or family planning or, institutionalized delivery. For everything, we are going to the same health worker. So how overwhelming, overburdening it could be. And I'm from India, so it matches exactly with the school's education system as well. We burden students in India in so much. And I was discussing with my partner, the societal rate in India because of high expectation and the burden is very, very high. So there is a similarity, and I'm curious, what can we do about it? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have answers. My hope with this is what this framework is doing for us, is having us ask deeper questions. And one of the deeper questions that it helped to surface for us is around equity. So one of the things that, when you're looking at data and trying to talk about progress, and I know this is kind of a small chart, but in the middle of this chart are the total increase of college enrollment. So we went from 34% to 42%. And that sounds like a gain. But we found it was very important to look at subpopulations. And here in the US, populations by race and income were very meaningful. And so all of a sudden you see American Indian students are at 21% going to 24%. That's a different story. And for us to think about subpopulations, and coming to speak with you today, I thought, what are the subpopulations that you need to think about? Because that context matters. And while we work on national scales and global scales, we're having to add to our mindset that context of how does it differ in this place by race. I think you brought up, Debbie, the culture, the religion, gender. Those are additional contexts that change the subpopulations and how they experience the system. So good to kind of go a little deeper in this. This uncovered for us that there was an achievement gap when you look at lower academics, but even an opportunity gap. So if you look at these little down here, this is who gets enrolled in gifted programs, kind of who gets that extra lift. And Black and Hispanic students don't have the same access to the gifted programs here in the US. And then when you get to challenges, they face greater challenges. You see higher rates of suspension and expulsion, particularly for Black students. So that has us thinking about what are the things they're not getting access to, and what additional burdens are they carrying by the system. And I just want to call out my last thing I want to share with you that we're learning about, and we're just starting on this learning, is you see this slide starts with achievement gap. And we've been shifting and thinking about that word achievement gap because it could suggest that students can't achieve. And we need to be careful, and we begin to think about what would it mean to talk about the opportunity gap? Because we know it's the system that's failing students and not providing opportunities. But our language matters, and it starts to paint a picture of that student and whether or not they're capable. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of asset-based framing, and I say a little bit because I can't do justice to. We had a gentleman by the name of Trabian Shorter come to our May all-staff meeting. We have a recording of it that I can make available as a resource, but I'm going to give you a little teaser here, and my hope is this will make you more interested and you'll want to learn more. It made me interested, but I'm going to use his slides and I'm going to pale in comparison to what Trabian can share with you. But this idea of we're primed and we have an unconscious bias sometimes because of the stories and images that our society gives us. And what's our role as funders in thinking about changing that narrative or leading with a different narrative? So he brought Daniel Kahneman's work to us to really help us get and understand unconscious bias, this idea that the associative mind is fast, and our conscious mind that does that really rational, deliberative thinking is slower. And you all, many of you work here. I bet your associative mind has a lot going on because of the pace that we work. So we have to work extra hard to slow down and be conscious and use that conscious mind because that associative mind looks for data that fits what it already believes. So he helped us understand the power of narrative, and that narrative is what society uses to reinforce what's good in a community. And so there's three parts. There's the hero. That's somebody that has admirable qualities and an aspiration that we think is associated with the success of the community. They're facing some sort of problem or villain, and they have to overcome it to meet some community good. So these stories we tell every day. And so if you look for stories, so this is interactive part, warning, warning. So I want you to stand up. If you have heard the story, you don't have to believe it or know the details about it, but have heard the story about Black poverty rates being very high in the US. Okay, now raise your hand if you have heard the story that Black and Hispanic dropout rate is high. Now wave your hand if you've heard the story that Black employment rates exceed the national average. So some people have heard those stories. This is a lot of narrative. Have a seat. So what if we looked at the asset side of this story? Anybody can tell me how many Black millionaires there are? And USP people can't do this. You know the answers. Anybody want to take a guess? Guess? Or you want to make a guess? Just a guess. How many Black millionaires in the US? 1 million. The answer is 110,000 when it was last reported. What's interesting is you think about all the sports stars and all the entertainment stars, that doesn't get you to 110. So they must be, but yet society puts out that those are the careers that they should aspire to become millionaires. So there's a story even behind this story. But it's interesting that that's not something we know. That's not the story we tell ourselves in our society. So how many Black, brown boys are in college? Anyone want to take a guess? Of that population, how many are in college? So we talked about the dropout rate, but how many are in college? Anyone want to make a guess? Oh, see, we're not so sure about these asset-based ones. Fact is that of the Black and Hispanic people that are 18 to 24 years old, 33% of the Black are in college, 35% of Hispanic are in college. That's a different story than the dropout rate, but we don't tell that story. How many Black-owned businesses? This is making an impact on the community and their family wage. Any idea? This one blew me away. There are 2.6 million Black-owned businesses, and they're growing at a rate of 210%. That's an economic engine. So I'm just using these as an example because we all have heard those negative stories. And so as a collective society, these are the stories we're not telling. And I think as funders, we have a unique responsibility to tell those stories. So deficit framing is defining people by their problems, ignoring their contribution, and then remediating them so that they're less of a burden on society. Oh, we'll fix that so that they're not as big of a problem. Instead, asset framing, the thing you want to have front and center of your mind is, how do I define people by their aspirations, their contributions, then acknowledge the challenge, and then invest in them to continue their contribution to society. Continue that contribution, because they're already contributing to society. We just don't tell that story. So I'm going to skip this exercise because I'm running out of time. In this exercise, I would have had you turn to a partner and talk about one of our grantee partner organizations in terms of who they serve. This was pretty stark experience for a lot of us in the U.S. program because we used a lot of these deficit words in describing those organizations. So let's take a look at one of those organizations as an example. So this is a real organization. This is how they portrayed their mission. Our program helps at-risk youth in high-crime neighborhoods stay on track to graduate high school and avoid becoming a negative statistic. So back to that story of becoming a problem that you're going to mitigate for society. There's a lot of deficit words in there. Anybody have thoughts on what deficit words you guys might use in the fields that you're working in? Anybody? Yes.
Yeah, so we use a lot of words like low performing.
Low performing. Yes. Yes, low performing districts. Nice. Trabian does a nice associative exercise. Underserved equals undeserved. So our minds do quick associations of if they aren't doing well, they don't deserve to do well, or they are not capable. So we do some quick associations of things. Other deficit words that you might use. Yes.
We also tag people with words like, that kid's weak, or
Technically weak, yeah. So not their contribution, but the deficit. And this isn't to say that you should never use deficit words. This is about bringing that conscious mind to the forefront and choosing when. Because you wouldn't use these words when you're standing in front of the person you're serving. This is not how you would describe a trusted friend and partner that you see as being part of the solution. And so this, because we think of ourselves, I think, as being part of the solution. And yet we start by asking organizations to tell us, what's the problem statement? What would it be if we instead ask them, what's your aspiration? When we ask them for funding, or for proposals for our funding. So we flipped it. Now, this is an organization you could support. Our program helps young people who are hungry for an education to overcome obstacles and achieve their dreams for them and for themselves and society. Same kids, same organization, very different narrative. So in sum, I just want to make sure that we're hardwired. This is not a personal failing of you not being able to turn off that unconscious bias, but that's how our brain works. That's how we survive. But we have to do the extra work, the conscious mind work, to overcome that and to balance that out. And what we find is it helps us see more solutions because you start looking for the assets. And then how do you leverage those assets rather than trying to mitigate problems? So I hope this has been helpful. I wanted to share this with you just so that the P16 journey might suggest to you that health care worker and some of the factors that might create momentum for them in their journey, that subpopulations and equity and the context around those subpopulations matters in the outcomes, and that asset framing gives you another tool to think about in leveraging what could make a difference for students. So thank you very much.